The topic that I was asked to speak on tonight was the history of the Spanish in the American West. This is coming from a book that a colleague and I and my colleague named Danielle Villa, we wrote this book that's called U.S. Mexican Spanish West of the Mississippi. And the content for my presentation tonight will basically come from that book. My name is Jens Clegg. I'm a professor of Spanish and linguistics at Purdue University Fort Wayne. I have a PhD in Hispanic linguistics from the University of New Mexico, and I work here at Purdue University Fort Wayne. I've researched and published on Spanish in the United States for nearly 30 years now. And then you can see in the link there at the bottom, that's the name of the book that we published that is the basis for this today. So to start off with a disclaimer, just to put some boundaries around what we're talking about. When we say Spanish in the US, it's larger and much more diverse than just Mexican Spanish west of the Mississippi. There are many different communities of Spanish speakers throughout the United States, and they're all just as valid, interesting, and important as Mexican Spanish in the United States. Another important disclaimer is variation. All dialects communities of speakers are not the same and will show variation based on individual speakers. So each community may do different things. So if how you speak is different from what I talk about today or is different from the communities that I talk about today, there's no judgments about your community or the way that you speak. All different communities are different, and that's a good thing. We like variety in language. Some context on Spanish in the United States. As of the 2020 census, there are about 40 million Spanish speakers in the US that make up about 19% of the total population. By those numbers, the United States is the fifth largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. Allen County has not been a great seat of Hispanic population, but it has been growing for years now. You can see by the numbers that it's gone from 6.5% in 2010 up to 9.5% now in 2025, about 38,000 people. So it's becoming a larger community in our area here in Fort Wayne. How did all this start? As we know, there were many early Spanish settlements here in the United States, or what is currently called the United States. There was a settlement in St. Augustine, Florida, as early as 1565. That settlement eventually was taken away and disappeared. In New Mexico, they started their first settlements in 1598, but the first settlement that was there and that lasted long-term was Santa Fe in 1607. By comparison, you've got Roanoke in North Carolina in 1585, which that colony was lost. And then their first permanent one that actually lasted was Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. So Spanish was the first European language spoken in what is the United States today. And so it's been here for a very long time. Early Spanish settlements that came around during those early times, places like San Antonio, Texas, San Diego, California, Los Angeles, Santa Fe, Albuquerque, Tucson, all those towns that were founded very early on in the history of the United States. For the most part, these settlements were very small and they were isolated, and they were on what at the time was the farthest northern frontier of the Spanish Empire, basically as far away as you could get from Spain. So where did the people who came to what we consider the United States today that were Spanish speakers, where did they come from? Well, Mexico was settled earlier in the United States. Settlements of Europeans started popping up as early as 1519 in Mexico. And so Mexico had early Spanish colonizers who came in and mixed with the indigenous peoples and created a large population of mestizos. And all those people lived and were in Mexico for a long period of time. And then after the people who came to America, to what we consider the United States, so that's New Mexico, Texas, California, Arizona, those areas, were people who were born and raised in Mexico and who spoke Mexican Spanish, and they were primarily mestizos. And so how did this affect their language? What's interesting about it is one of the questions that we often get when we talk about Spanish in the United States and the Americas, in fact, is why don't we use the theta in the Americas? As we all know, in Spain, the theta is a common sound, and it's used in Madrid and northern Spain. And the example that's a classic difference there you can see below is casa versus caza. Casa with the S as a verb means to marry, and with the Z, caza means to hunt. And so the S versus the Z in Spain, that's a difference that changes the meaning of the word. But both of those words would be pronounced the same in the Americas, casa and casa. So what happened to that theta? Why didn't it make it into the Spanish that went to Mexico and eventually to the United States? The leading theory is that the people who came to the Americas primarily were first from southern Spain. And southern Spain has a different sound dialect from Madrid and central and northern Spain. In southern Spain, they don't use the theta, and that's why it never made it to the Americas. And so here in the Americas, they use just S for both of those sounds for casa and casa. And so over the next 100 years, Mexico had lots of time to form its own unique dialect. And that dialect is what was taken to New Mexico and Colorado and Arizona, Texas, and California, those areas, was that Mexican Spanish. Another influence that was important in that dialect was the indigenous languages that were in the area, like Nahuatl and Maya and other things like that, introduced a number of different words and phrases into what became Mexican Spanish and then Spanish in the US. One of the other key factors that affected language in the Spanish of the Southwest in the United States was isolation. The distances between the main population centers like Mexico City, as you can see, from Mexico City to San Antonio, Texas, was 800 miles, which at that time was a very long wagon trip. It took 2 months to get from Mexico City up to San Antonio. And then for those who were living up further north in Santa Fe, New Mexico, it was another 700 miles from San Antonio up to Santa Fe, which is another couple of months of travel. So mail, instructions from the government, and supplies and those kinds of shipments were very rare. So people were basically isolated and on their own. And that isolation was also isolation for the language. And they also had contact with new and different indigenous languages in the United States and in those areas that helped them to develop a unique form of Spanish in that part of the United States in the Southwest. So the next thing that happens that has a big effect on the language of the Spanish in the Southwest is American expansionism and manifest destiny. As we know, manifest destiny is the 19th century doctrine or belief that the expansion of the US throughout the American continents was both justified and inevitable. And so Americans come slowly moving across the country. It starts with the Texas Revolution in 1836. Then we have the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. And as you can see on the image on the screen, we go from having big chunks of Mexico that are part of what we call the US now, move from Mexico to the United States as a result of the Mexican-American War and the Texas Revolution. This is settled by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. And as a result of this treaty and of the Mexican-American War, Mexico seceded half of its original territory to the United States in the form of the states that we saw on the map and that we've mentioned before. As a result of the treaty, Mexican citizens that were in the territory that was now passing over the United States had to make a choice. They could stay where they were and become US citizens with all the rights of US citizens, or they could move back to Mexico. Some people did make the choice to move down into Mexico and to not become part of the United States, but the majority stayed where they were and stayed with their farms and their ranches and their families and their cities and became American citizens. They became the first Spanish-speaking American citizens. At the time of the signing of the treaty, there were roughly 80,000 Mexican citizens living across Texas, California, Arizona, and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado as well. And so those people became US citizens when the border moved around them. The next thing that happened was the Gadsden Purchase, which was in 1853. The US wanted to acquire some more land to help finish their railroad. As a result, the border once again moved south, and what's now Las Cruces, New Mexico, became part of the United States. What's interesting is Las Cruces was founded by people who, at the time of the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, they chose to leave the United States and go down to Mexico. And at the time, Las Cruces was part of Mexico again. And then with the Gadsden Purchase, the border crossed them again. And one of the things they like to say when you talk to them is that the border double crossed them because it crossed them twice. After that one, they all just stayed there and became US citizens. During the US territorial period, which is from 1848 to 1912, there was a huge wave of migration from the United States into these new territories, and we're talking about mostly white Protestant Americans. As an example, California had about 10,000 Mexicans of the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But just a few years later, by 1855, there were now 300,000 Anglos who had moved into California, primarily because of the gold rush of 1849. But there comes a huge swing in population and in control of the government and also in language. As a counterexample, New Mexico had a much slower transition. They didn't have the same effect of the gold rush. And they also had a much larger Mexican population. There were about 60,000 Mexicans living in the state of New Mexico. But over time, the white population got larger and larger, and the influence of English became stronger and stronger. So how does this affect the Spanish language when we've got all these people coming in who don't speak Spanish? Well, the new settlers, they speak English, and quickly as they come into these areas, they become business leaders in the region and gain quite a bit of control over the economy of those areas and the land in those areas as well. The government that's coming in is a US government, which is primarily conducted in English. And so the governing is done in English. The school system, they had a school system that was a parochial school system that was basically run through the Catholic Church at the time. But as the US government moved in, more and more public schools were created, and all those schools were taught only in English. So we all of a sudden have a huge influence of English coming in on these people who are Spanish speakers. Another one of the things that affected the language was the economic reality. And that reality was that English is the language of success. And if people wanted to have economic success, they had to learn English. And so this was beginning to affect Spanish. And so two language effects came about because of all this influx of English-speaking Americans. The two things that happened were language contact and generational language loss. We'll talk a little bit about each of those. Obviously, language contact is when there are two different languages that are occupying the same linguistic space. Whenever that happens, the two languages will come into contact, and it will result in language borrowing and bilingualism. Those are two things that will come out anytime two languages come into contact. So when we talk about borrowing, languages that are in contact with each other and that have to do business and work with each other will borrow words and phrases from each other. And English was affected by this as well, because English borrowed many place names, food vocabulary, and cultural concepts were borrowed from Spanish. So you've got some examples of place names like California, Colorado, Los Angeles, Santa Fe. We can make a huge list of all the different cities in the Southwest that have Spanish names. We've also got food items, which are common on American plates today: burritos, tacos, enchiladas, other things like that, that were all borrowed from Spanish. One thing that many people may not know, but is common, is the vocabulary that cowboys use. Much of that vocabulary comes from Spanish words. You've got la riata, which is lariat, and rodeo, which is rodeo. A Mustang comes from the Spanish word mesteño. Adobe from construction. Rancho becomes ranch. And there are lots of other words like that. There are whole dictionaries of words that came into the cowboy vernacular from Spanish. And so English is borrowing lots of different words that include these different categories into English, and we still use them today. The Spanish, on the other hand, borrowed quite a few different words from English, things like technology, education, business words. So you've got words like tractor, tren, televisión, radio, things like that. In the education field, there were lots of words that were borrowed from English, like principal, campus, club, crédito, grado, high school. In business, aplicación, meeting, cheque, computadora. Lots of different words were borrowed both directions, into Spanish and also into English, as a result of the contact. Bilingualism is one of the other natural outcomes of language contact. And it's what you would expect. People need to be able to communicate between the two groups. And so bilinguals will arise as those who can do the communicating. And the most common route for obtaining bilinguals is the children who are raised with both languages around them. So most often the bilinguals end up being the second generation that is raised speaking both languages from early childhood. And so they grow up with both languages and become bilingual and become the interpreters and translators and those that kind of are the go-betweens between the two groups of languages. So we had mentioned that language contact was one of the effects. One of the other effects is generational language loss. So what happens, and this is true for almost every immigrant community in the United States. It's been studied heavily in the Spanish community, but this will apply to just about any other immigrant group. And we refer to it as the three-generational model. Generation one is the parents who come and who speak monolingual Spanish. And so at the time of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, all of those parents in that group would have been monolingual Spanish speakers with little to no English. That next generation, generation two, are their children who are raised in a context where they've got Spanish and English around them, and they learn both languages and become bilingual. Now, the children of generation two, which is now generation three, and the grandchildren of the first generation, will have limited to no proficiency in Spanish, but a high proficiency in English. So basically what we see is that the home language, the Spanish, very quickly leaves by that third generation. And by the fourth generation, there's little to nothing left of the familial language, and English has replaced it. And so this is a common pattern. It keeps repeating itself. If you want to go back in history, you can look at the Italian immigrants who came, the Irish immigrants who came, the German immigrants who came to Pennsylvania early in the history of the United States. Those groups followed this same pattern where there was the first generation of migrants that were monolingual in one language, but by the third and then the fourth, there was basically nothing left. And so this is what happened in the Southwest of the United States is these families would very quickly transition over to English. And so the three-generation model, it makes it seem like the future of the Spanish in the US is that there wouldn't be much of a future and it would just basically disappear. However, a big factor in changing that and not letting that happen is continued migration from Spanish-speaking countries that reinforce the existing Spanish and ensure that there's a continual presence that the Spanish continues to be there. So after the territorial period, which is 1912 to the present, one of the important factors is what's called the Border Patrol. The Border Patrol was founded in 1924. Prior to that time period, the border was open. People could go back and forth between the two countries without any problems, without any documents, without anyone stopping them. And so prior to that, there was quite a bit of moving back and forth across the border. After the Border Patrol, there was still a fair amount of migration that was happening, and that migration was usually caused by large events. The first large event would have been the Mexican Revolution, which was from 1910 to 1920. And the Mexican Revolution was a very turbulent and violent time, and many Mexicans, especially in northern Mexico, fled Mexico to come to the United States to get away from the war and to find a place where they could be peaceful and find jobs. So there was quite a bit of migration during that time period. The next big event was World War I. During the time of World War I, all of the men were off fighting, so they needed workers to come in and work in the factories and help with the war effort. And so lots of Mexicans crossed the border to come and work in those jobs. Same pattern happened again with World War II, more migration because of labor shortage. And then after World War II, and also during parts of the end of World War II, we have the Bracero program, which was a program where the United States brought workers in from Mexico to come. And the idea was that it would be a short-term program. They would come, they would work a few years, and they would go back. But many of those workers came, they formed families, and they settled and they stayed in the United States. So we have quite a bit of migration from Mexico into the United States between that time period and all the way up into nearly to the 2000s. Now, during that early time period, they don't have great numbers of exactly how many people came across the border and how many Mexicans came into the United States, but they estimate that it was at least 4.5 million or more people who came and began to live in the United States and speak Spanish. And as they would come in, that would ensure that there were new generations of Spanish speakers and also newer communities. And so they would reinforce those cities and those places and build up large Hispanic population centers, which, as we know now, we have Los Angeles, California, Albuquerque, New Mexico, El Paso and McAllen, Texas. Even in Chicago, Illinois, we have large Mexican populations who came into the United States speaking Spanish, building communities. And as those communities got larger, they brought in with them both the language, more of the culture, and it allowed the transmission of the language from generation one to generation two to be stronger because there were more opportunities to speak the language and more people around who spoke it. And so in some cases, the generational model in places like Los Angeles and Albuquerque and El Paso and other areas where there's a big Hispanic population, they've been able to stop the three generational model of loss of language and get to where they're getting into fifth and sixth generation people who are bilingual because they have a community of Spanish speakers around them. So that's part of what's helped maintain a presence of Spanish in the United States. So coming back to today, as we mentioned earlier, 40 million Spanish speakers in the United States, which is 19% of the population. Another recent thing that's happened is that California has become the first, well, technically New Mexico was the first state to have majority Hispanic. California would be the second to be majority Hispanic with 41% Hispanic. So Spanish is very alive and very well in the Southwest. In this map, you can see the percentage of Hispanic or Latino population. And what's not surprising is along the border areas where we have borders with Mexico, we have that 80% or more Hispanic population. And as you move further away from the border, the colors start to get lighter and you slowly start to get less Hispanic population. But it has expanded beyond the original states of just Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California, and up into Washington and Oregon, Nevada, and Colorado, and many other places. What is the Spanish in the United States? This is an important question so we can understand what it is. And the first concept to discuss about this is Spanish in the US versus Spanglish. You've probably all heard the term Spanglish. It's a pretty common phrase. So let's talk about some myths and facts about it. When people talk about Spanglish, just the average people, they describe it as the mixing of Spanish and English. And with Spanglish, there are three different things that come. There are negative connotations. It implies that mixing is a deficit language strategy, and some claim that it's a new language. I'm going to address each of those things one by one. The negative connotations. Most non-Spanish speakers, when they say Spanglish, it tends to have a negative connotation, and they view it as this form of language with no limits, no rules. It's kind of random and chaotic. It's just a mishmash of Spanish and English. Bilingual Spanish speakers in the US, when they use this term, frequently they use it in a way that is basically saying that they don't feel like their Spanish is as good as other monolingual Spanish, like Mexican or Guatemalan Spanish. So they have a negative view of their own form of Spanish. And so the term Spanglish is kind of used pejoratively by bilinguals and by non-Spanish speakers as well. And rarely is it used as a proud way to describe bilingual speak. So there are a lot of negative connotations with the term Spanglish. One of the other problems with the term Spanglish is it implies that there's a language deficit strategy. The implication is that people are switching between the two languages because they don't know words or phrases in one language or another. So since they don't know the word, they must switch to another language to go back and forth. And this implies that they have a deficit, that there's language that they don't know. And because they don't know the language or have incomplete language, they use two different languages just to express this, which is not necessarily true. And it's insulting to bilingual speakers and their language abilities to have this perspective that, oh, they do it because they have to. And that's not the case. Other people have tried to propose that Spanglish is a new language that's emerging in the United States. And that claim doesn't work for several reasons. One of them is the concept of generational transmission. Generational transmission means that a language is transmitted from one generation to the next over time. And it implies that there are native speakers of a language. And we don't have any native speakers of Spanglish, and it doesn't get transmitted from generation to generation. New languages also develop unique grammar rules that are different from the two languages that they came from. And in the case of Spanish in the US, that hasn't happened. Also, new languages are predictable and there's repetition. So things happen once and then they keep happening over and over and over. So you use a certain phrase enough times. And with Spanglish, that hasn't been the case. So the argument that it's becoming a new language doesn't work. It's not a new language. So what is it if it's not a new language? Well, for the reasons that we just discussed, linguists and scholars, we generally don't use the term Spanglish to describe Spanish-English bilingual communication in the US. We call it US Spanish. And for the dialect that I wrote about in my book, it's US Mexican Spanish specifically. So what does it look like? Clearly, US Spanish is influenced by English. We can't make the claim that it's not. And that influence comes in the form of three main linguistic categories. One is code switching. Some people also call that translanguaging. The other is borrowings, and the next is calques. And we'll talk a little bit about each of those. Code switching is basically switching back and forth between two different languages. So it's mixing them. So you can see an example there. So you todavía haven't decided lo que vas a hacer next week. And you can see that they're just maneuvering in and out of both languages. The example at the bottom is one that I got from some of my students here in Indiana, and they said, bueno, okay, when I was in elementary school, casi no miraba personas hispanas. Ya para los años que empecé high school, ya empezaba a mirar más. So you can see again, it's kind of the use of both languages within one sentence going back and forth. And that is something we see often with bilinguals in the US. Next is what's called borrowing. And borrowing is when we take words from one language, use them in the other. We saw some examples of borrowing earlier in the presentation, but we'll give you some more specific ones here. You can see, yo vi una troca verde, which in English would be, I saw a green truck. And you can see that the word truck has become troca. It's been given Spanish pronunciation. It's been used in a Spanish sentence. It's basically been integrated into Spanish. So they're not speaking English when they say it. They're just integrating it into Spanish. It's now a Spanish word. Some other examples are un ride, like a ride. Textear, meaning to text. Que nice, which is how nice. And there are lots of other examples that you can find. You can find dictionaries and lists of words that have been borrowed from English into Spanish. And in any bilingual community, it doesn't matter what group they are, borrowing is the most common form of language contact. And when you sit down and actually document language contact and look at it closely, borrowings are the thing you'll find the most of. It can also be multi-word structures, not just single words. So an example is ice cream, which is two words, but in Spanish became ice cream, or high school, which is two words, which became high school. So a phrase can also be borrowed as one phrase into Spanish. The types of borrowings you can get, as you look at the Spanish in the US, you'll find long established words that have been fully adapted and integrated, and they've been part of the Spanish language for years. Televisión, troca, bistec, cóctel, bacon. These kinds of words, you can find them in Spain. They're used throughout all the Spanish-speaking world and listed in dictionaries because they've been borrowed long enough that they're considered mainstream words now. And then there's a concept called a nonce borrowing, which means like a one-time borrowing. And they're words that are spontaneously borrowed, but may or may not be adapted or integrated, like el door, la cacerola, things like that. Another category that's interesting is place and person names. These are ones where you don't really have a choice. They'll obligatorily be borrowed into Spanish. So everyone's favorite store, Walmart, becomes El Walmart, right? And what else are you going to call it? You're not going to translate it and try to make a translation of it. You're just going to call it by its name. Place names are like that too. You've got El Fort Wayne or La Indiana. Things like that will get borrowed directly into Spanish as well, because that's, if you live in Fort Wayne, you're going to use the term Fort Wayne. Calquing is a little bit different of a phenomenon. It's similar to borrowing, but also different. And what it is the extension of a new meaning to an existing word. So here we've got the example of estoy en el grado ocho, which is I'm in the 8th grade. The word grado exists in Spanish, but in Spanish, the word grado means degree, as in how many degrees is it Fahrenheit or Celsius. It does not mean grade in school. But in the United States, as our grade system uses grados as the way of moving from year to year, the word grado has now come to mean grade in school. And so it was given a new meaning. The word already existed. It's an existing Spanish word with a new meaning. Another example of that is the word aplicación, which in English, application as in a job application. But in Spanish, aplicación means to apply something, like to apply lotion to your skin. The new meaning of aplicación as a job application is a calque. It means that they've borrowed the meaning of job application from English and given it to the Spanish word. So that's what calques are. And so you'll get those three phenomena. You'll get code switching, borrowing, and calquing. And those things happen frequently and often in Spanish in the United States. But it doesn't represent a new language. It just represents using English items within another language. So bilinguals choose the language, words, and phrases that best describe what they want to communicate. They have access to two languages, and they express themselves in both of those languages. Living in an English-dominant world will necessarily affect their Spanish. So who speaks U.S. Spanish? Who are the people that are doing the speaking? So Spanish, they're primarily Spanish-English bilinguals. To be bilingual, when we talk about bilingual, what we mean is that it's someone who learned both languages as a child, and they consider both of their languages as their mother tongue. Now, the studies that they've done on code switching in the United States with US Spanish, what they've shown is that using authentic code switching, so stuff that sounds natural, it's only possible for true bilinguals. People who are not true bilinguals will not be able to code switch efficiently and effectively. They will sound awkward and clunky. Code switching is considered an advanced language skill. That ability to maneuver within two languages instantaneously and simultaneously is an advanced language skill. It's not a language deficit. So why is US Spanish different from monolingual Spanish? When I say monolingual Spanish, I mean like Spanish in Mexico, Spanish in Spain, Spanish in Spanish-speaking countries. The bilinguals live in the two different worlds, one that's English dominant. And so in their life, they might have their work in English and their school in English. But when they go home, there's families in Spanish, their communities in Spanish, their churches in Spanish. So they live in two different worlds, and the two different vocabularies don't always line up. So as they live in the two different worlds, they'll come across realities that can only be expressed in one language or the other. One of my favorite examples is the difference between almuerzo and lonche. So almuerzo is lunch. If we get a dictionary and look it up, it says lunch is the definition of almuerzo. But almuerzo and lunch culturally are two very different concepts. When you say almuerzo in the Spanish culture, it's a large meal shared with family. And you're sitting around the table, there's multiple courses. Like I said, it's a big meal. But lunch in the United States is not the same thing. We pack our little sack lunches or our little box lunches, and we call that lunch. So for Spanish speakers in the United States, when they're around this and they see a little bag of food, to them, that's a lonche, not an almuerzo, because they're different things. Almuerzo is the big family lunch, and lonche is the little lunch you take in your bag to work. And so they'll use both words. They'll use almuerzo to mean one thing and lonche to mean another thing. So then it's not that they're borrowing one because they don't know the word. They're borrowing them because they're different words to them with different meanings. Another example is high school. For Spanish-speaking kids that grow up in the United States and who've never been to school anywhere else, the only thing they know is high school. And so they'll use the word high school, and they have nothing to compare it to because they've never been to school in Mexico or any other country. And so high school means something different from la preparatoria or colegio or whatever they might call it in different places. So how much has English influenced US Spanish? This is an important question, an important part of the conversation. Most of what people call Spanglish is in fact Spanish with English words and phrases mixed in. So I've done a lot of research on this issue. I've gathered a lot of data in New Mexico. And in 2010, what I found was that English origin nouns, so nouns borrowed from English into Spanish, were only 10% of the nouns that were used in the data that I found. And so if English ones are 10%, that implies that the other 90% are Spanish nouns. So the English influence is only 10%. And of those 10%, at least half of them are nouns that can be found in Spain, Mexico, anywhere else, in Spanish dialects throughout the world. So the words that they're using here in the United States in US Spanish are not that different from other places across the world. In 2012, I did some other research that was more broad throughout the Southwest Spanish. And I found that the verb system of Southwest Spanish shows very little influence from English. When you look at the verbs that they're using and the frequencies in which they're using them, they pattern after native Spanish speakers' verb systems. And there are few to no words that are influenced by English in the verb system. In nouns, we saw lots of nouns that were borrowed, but verbs are rarely borrowed. What I did find is that the Spanish in the Southwest, it patterns more like rural Mexican Spanish verb usage than educated Mexican Spanish verb usage, which is not surprising. Another study that I did in 2013 on English influence in the vocabulary in the Spanish in the Southwest. So this is again a broader set of data. 12% of the total nouns were English origin. And again, most of those 12% were words that you can find in dictionaries of Spanish throughout the world. So the English influence is actually not as big as we like to think it is. Most of what people that are speaking Spanish in the US are speaking is Spanish with a little English mixed in here and there. But at its core, it is Spanish. And so as a summary of all of that, and this is what we found in our book, is that most of what we call Spanish in the US, it's Spanish. And it looks just like monolingual Spanish from most other countries. It compares very favorably with Mexican Spanish because it is more or less a descendant of Mexican Spanish. And the English influence does play a role, but it's not as deep as some claim. And the Spanish of the United States is a variety of Spanish that's just as Spanish and just as good as any other variety of Spanish in the world. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much.
Hmm.
We do have a couple questions for you. So let's
Excellent.
see. If you could please talk about what role the Catholic Church may have played in maintaining, or if it played a role in spreading Spanish in the American West.
In the early phases, it definitely played a role in maintaining. Spreading was not something that was really going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Maintaining was something that could happen because the parochial schools allowed their teachers to teach in Spanish. And so the kids could go to school and continue to learn Spanish, and not just to speak Spanish, but to read and to write and to be literate in Spanish. And so in that sense, it helped maintain. But the United States, early in the 1900s, fought a huge campaign to pull away from parochial schools and move the education to public schools. So all the funding was in public schools. And that put a real dent in the Catholic schools throughout New Mexico and California and other areas. And so their effect was not able to continue for long term because of the loss of the funding and the pressure from the US government for everyone to put all instruction into English. And
Thank you.
there are countless stories. If you do research on these bilingual kids that grew up in New Mexico and Colorado and California, these areas, there are countless stories of them going to public school and being beaten because they didn't speak English. And then they had to learn quickly because the US education system was going to make them speak English, like it or not.
Thank you. Somebody has a question. They say they recently attended an online presentation from UW-Madison,
Mhm.
an anti-colonization of our world language curricula. Sounds like they're wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit on that subject.
So that is something that we do talk about, and I know that my colleagues and I have talked about it at our school. And for us in Spanish, the conversation takes a look, well, not doesn't take a look, it's kind of framed around the European Spanish bias, meaning that in all the textbooks and the things that were presented to teach Spanish to people, they give preference and priority to Spanish words and Spanish phrases instead of things like Mexican Spanish, which, there are hundreds of millions of Mexican Spanish speakers, and there are only about 45 to 50 million Spanish speakers in Spain. But yes, the old European um, colonization system is still going strong. We're trying to address that and make sure that future textbooks use more words that are local words and words that fit in more with the way people speak around us here.
Thank you. And if you could speak on maybe how family historians could use language clues like surnames or word usage to try to trace their Spanish-speaking ancestors.
So I think that understanding how the naming system in Spanish and in Hispanic cultures works will definitely make it easier. Learning about maternal surnames and paternal surnames, and that both are frequently used and how that works can help family historians. As far as words, as you're going through birth records and death records and other kinds of records, as genealogists do, having a good dictionary nearby will be very helpful as you have to look up different concepts. And there will be different ways that people sometimes spell things. And so you'll have to pay attention to some of the sounds that will get confused often are B and V. So the letters B and V, in Spanish, they're pronounced the same. So if a word starts with a V, you still say it with a B, but you write it with the V. And so when people who were not fully educated and have a little bit less education and they would write, they would confuse their B's and their V's. And so you would get words that would change. It might change the meaning if you interpret as a B or a V, but being aware of that difference will be helpful in reading words and looking at some of those things. So that's one example I can give is the B and the V.
Thank you. And one more question. So, as far as modern migration and media, like film or social media, how have you seen those things continue to reshape Spanish in more recent years?
So in recent years, the trend that we've noted is Mexican migration to the United States has actually reversed. More Mexicans are leaving the United States than coming into the United States. And that was especially true during when we had the recession in 2018 in those time periods and the jobs were really low. And also during the pandemic, people were going back to Mexico and back to their family because life was better for them there. Um, but what has changed is Central Americans are the largest group that are migrating to the United States now. And the Central American dialect of Spanish is different. And so now what we're getting is these long established Mexican communities that are here in the United States are now being filled with other Central Americans. And as the Central American dialect is coming in contact with the Mexican dialect, we're getting some very interesting phenomena and things that are happening as they interact. And as one of the things that they've found that's fascinating is the youth. So the younger Central Americans will quickly adopt Mexican sounds and Mexican phrasing and words because they want to be considered as people who've been here longer. They want to fit in. So they start to try to sound more like Mexicans because the Mexicans have been here longer and that's more prestigious in their eyes. And so those are some of the things that are happening in those communities as we get more Central Americans and we get more dialects in contact. Chicago is a fascinating one to look at for that because in Chicago, you've got two big Hispanic groups. You've got the Puerto Ricans who've come into Chicago and then the Mexicans. And as they come together, there's a lot of those same factors of dialect contact and interesting things that come out of them. And one of my colleagues, her name is Kim Potowski, researches what's called Mexicans, who are the blends of, Mexican parents and Puerto Rican parents that'll have children, and those kids will grow up speaking both different forms of Spanish. And there's some very interesting things happening there in Chicago right now.
Thank you. And we did have one more question pop in. I'm not going to get the pronunciation right, but it says, are you aware of any pockets of El Boseo used in any regions of the US recently or historically? I think only one small region of Mexico still uses it.
So when we're talking about, just to be clear, there's a difference between voseo and vosotros. Vosotros is the form that they use in Spain. That's the it's kind of like y'all in the South, but it's vosotros in Spain. Vos is different, and vos is something that definitely comes from Central America. And so when we hear voseo, more often than not, it's going to be a Central American phenomenon. The original Spanish in the US and what we see in New Mexico and in those areas had, I'm not aware of there being examples of the Vos there. But definitely as the Central Americans are coming in, we're getting more and more Vos and Voseo use here in the United States.
Thank you. So I think that will finish this up for this evening. I did stick our email address in the chat. It's genealogy@acpl.info. So if anybody has any additional questions or if you'd like a copy of the chat, please send us an email and we'll get that to you. So thank you so much, Professor Clegg. We really appreciate your time and all of the great information that you shared with us this evening. And thank you to everybody for attending. Good night.
Right.